There I stood, blood beginning to boil, watching this woman in her spotless BMW wave a violation notice like she owned the world. The day Margaret Thornfield slapped me with a $200 fine for parking at my own cabin was also the day she handed me the keys to destroy her entire HOA empire. The metallic clang of her new gate rattled through the autumn air as she blocked my bridge. The same bridge my grieving grandfather built with his bare hands in 1943. Unauthorized vehicle storage, she declared, pointing at my truck parked on family land that had been passed down through 3 generations. What Margaret didn't know was that I owned the only bridge connecting her precious subdivision to civilization. Every single resident had to cross my property to reach their $400,000 sense of home. Are you dealing with a power-hungry HOA president right now? Comment below where you're watching from, because what happened next will make your revenge fantasies look like child's play. Let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started. My name's Jake Morrison. I'm 34, and I'm a structural engineer who specializes in building bridges, which is going to be pretty important to this story. 2 years ago, my grandfather passed away and left me his 1940s fishing cabin on Pine Lake. This wasn't just any cabin. It sits on 3 acres of pristine waterfront, accessible only by a single-lane bridge that crosses over Whisper Creek. Now, I travel a lot for work, building renewable energy projects overseas, so I barely get to visit the place. But that cabin, it meant everything to me. Grandpa taught me to fish from that dock, showed me how to identify every bird call echoing across the water, and spent countless evenings telling stories about building that bridge with his own hands back in 1943. The area around the cabin had changed dramatically in the past 5 years. What used to be quiet forest and farmland was now a collection of lakeside estates, one of those cookie-cutter subdivisions where every house looks like it came straight from the same catalog. Nice enough, I guess, but not exactly the wilderness sanctuary Grandpa had envisioned. Enter Margaret Thornfield, 52 years old, moved from the city 3 years ago with dreams of becoming the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian of standards. She got herself elected HOA president by promising to elevate property values and community standards, which apparently meant measuring people's grass with a ruler and timing how long their visitors stayed. Margaret drove a spotless white BMW X7, kept her nails perfectly manicured, and carried a leather portfolio like she was closing million-dollar deals instead of hassling neighbors about mailbox colors. She had this way of looking at my cabin. She'd call it that rustic eyesore when she thought I couldn't hear. The classism was subtle, but unmistakable. So when I got back from a 6-month project in Denmark, imagine my surprise to find a brand new gate blocking the road to my bridge. Not just any gate. This thing was serious business, with concrete posts and a metallic clang that echoed through the trees every time it slammed shut. Margaret was waiting for me, portfolio in hand, her expensive perfume somehow cutting through the pine-scented air. She handed me an official-looking document claiming the bridge road was now community property based on a recent surveyor's report. According to her paperwork, road maintenance was the HOA's responsibility, which meant they controlled access. The violation notice was a work of art. $2,000 for unauthorized vehicle storage because my truck had been parked at the cabin, plus $50 for every day I didn't comply. The math was adding up fast. "I'm sure you understand," Margaret said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We simply can't have unauthorized vehicles cluttering our community roads. It's about property values, really." I ran my fingers along the rough concrete of those new gate posts, listening to the familiar sound of Whisper Creek babbling beneath the bridge. The whole situation felt surreal. This was the same bridge I'd crossed 1,000 times as a kid. The same creek where Grandpa taught me to skip stones. Most of the newer residents seemed to support Margaret's iron fist approach to community management, but the old-timers who remembered the area before the subdivision were quietly sympathetic. Betty Chin, a retired teacher who lived closest to the bridge, slipped me a note as I walked back to my truck. "Check the county record. Something's fishy." As I drove away, gravel crunching under my tires, I was already planning my next move. See, Margaret had made one crucial mistake. she assumed I was just another pushover resident who'd pay up and shut up. She had no idea she'd just picked a fight with someone who builds bridges for a living, and who knows exactly what kind of paperwork goes into owning one. Margaret didn't waste any time escalating things. Within a week of our gate encounter, I got a cease and desist letter from some lawyer with a fancy letterhead. The legal language was meant to intimidate, claiming my continued trespassing was endangering children in the community, which was rich, considering no kids even lived near the bridge. The letter demanded I pay the accumulated fines, which had somehow ballooned to $450, or face immediate legal action for property damage and public endangerment. Meanwhile, Margaret was busy at the town coffee shop, spreading whispers about how I was unstoppable and making threats, neither of which was remotely true. But you know how small-town gossip works? I could have gotten angry. I could have stormed over to Margaret's perfect little house and had it out with her right there on her manicured lawn. Instead, I did what engineers do best. I gathered data. The county courthouse smelled like old paper and floor wax, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. I spent 3 hours digging through property records, running my fingers over aged parchment documents that felt smooth as silk from decades of handling. What I found there was absolutely beautiful. Grandpa's original 1943 property deed didn't just cover the cabin and the 3-acre lot. It specifically included ownership of the entire bridge structure, described in precise detail down to the type of timber used and the depth of the foundation pilings. The HOA surveyor had done their homework on everything, except the most important part. They'd conveniently omitted this crucial detail from their report. But here's where it gets interesting. The deed included something called an easement clause that required me to allow reasonable access to anyone needing to cross the bridge. Seemed fair enough. Grandpa was always a reasonable man. But the devil, as they say, is in the details. The clause specifically defined reasonable as no more than 12 vehicles per day. 12. The current Lakeside Estate subdivision had 47 homes, most with at least 2 cars. Do the math. Knowledge nugget time. Easement rights can be limited by the original deed specifications, and courts almost always uphold the specific language written by the original property owner. Always check the fine print. It's usually there for a reason. When I realized I basically controlled access to half the subdivision, I'll admit, I smiled. But Margaret wasn't done yet. She escalated by installing a security camera aimed directly at my bridge, claiming it was for community safety monitoring. Then she began keeping a detailed log of my so-called violations. Every time I crossed to my own property, she documented it like she was building a federal case. The woman even pressured other residents to sign a petition demanding I cooperate with community standards. Most people signed it just to get her to stop, knocking on their doors. Margaret's teenage daughter was at one of these petition drives, and I swear that kid rolled her eyes so hard I worried she might need medical attention. But the community was starting to take notice. Betty Chen whispered to me at the post office, Whisper Creek babbling below us to mask our conversation, that Margaret had been asking questions about my finances. Apparently, she wanted to know if I could afford a legal fight. 3 longtime residents approached me privately over the next few days. Tom Hendress, a Vietnam veteran who lived on the lake, told me Margaret had harassed him about his American flag being too large for community standards. Sarah Walsh, who worked for the local newspaper, said Margaret had tried to get her fired for writing an article about property rights. An elderly couple, the Kowalskis, shared how Margaret had forced them to remove their bird feeders because they attracted undesirable wildlife. I was starting to understand this wasn't really about my bridge access. It was about a pattern of bullying that had been going on for months, and I'd just become the latest target. Margaret had turned our peaceful community into her personal kingdom, ruling it through fear and intimidation. The thing is, I'd dealt with petty tyrants before. Construction sites are full of people who think a little authority makes them Napoleon. But Margaret made a critical error in judgment. She picked on someone who actually knew how to fight back, and more importantly, someone with the patience to do it right. As I sat on my cabin porch that evening, Listening to the loon's call across the water, I realized this was bigger than my access rights. If I let Margaret steamroll me, she'd keep doing it to others. Someone had to make a stand, and I just happened to be the guy with the bridge. Margaret's next move was pure financial warfare. She filed a complaint with the county, claiming my bridge was structurally unsafe and demanding an expensive engineering inspection. To the tune of $3,200, she rallied the HOA board to vote on an emergency assessment for community safety and began spreading whispers around town that my overseas work was somehow suspicious. Apparently, building renewable energy projects in Denmark made me some kind of international man of mystery in Margaret's paranoid little world. But here's the thing about picking a fight with a bridge. Engineer over bridge safety. It's like challenging a chef to a cook-off in their own restaurant. I am a bridge engineer. I inspect bridges for a living. This particular bridge, I could assess it with my eyes closed. That Saturday morning, I gave my grandfather's bridge the full professional treatment. Every joint, every support beam, every stress point was photographed and documented. The sound of my boots on those solid planks echoed across the water as I worked, and the familiar scent of creosote preservative brought back memories of helping Grandpa with maintenance when I was 12. What I found was beautiful, in an engineering sense. Grandpa had overbuilt that bridge like he expected it to last until the next ice age. It was rated for 20 tons, strong enough to handle a fire truck if necessary. Meanwhile, I couldn't help noticing that Margaret's own deck had several obvious code violations visible from the bridge approach. Knowledge nugget. A bridge rated for 20 tons can easily handle normal residential traffic, and you should always get a second opinion on any required inspections, especially from someone with actual expertise in the field. Margaret's desperation was showing. She tried to get the town council to condemn my bridge as a public hazard, bringing along a petition she claimed had unanimous neighborhood support. Turns out half the signatures were forged, and the rest belonged to people who thought they were signing up for a community barbecue. When that failed, she filed for a restraining order, claiming I'd threatened her. Problem was, she had no witnesses because it never happened. The judge took one look at her evidence and basically laughed her out of court. But I wasn't sitting around waiting for Margaret's next attack. I was doing my homework. I called 3 of the residents who'd supposedly signed her petition. None of them had actually seen what they were signing. Margaret had shown up at their doors with a clipboard and some vague story about neighborhood improvements. Here's where it gets interesting. I live in a one-party consent state, which means I can legally record phone conversations without telling the other person. So when Margaret's lawyer called to negotiate, I hit record. 20 minutes in, that lawyer accidentally admitted they knew I owned the bridge, but were hoping I wouldn't fight it because most people don't understand property law. He actually said, and I quote, "Look, we're banking on this guy not knowing his rights. Wrong bet. Counselor." My cat Diesel had become an unofficial judge of character during all this drama. That orange tabby would sit in the cabin window and hiss every time Margaret's BMW drove past. Even my cat knew something was off about her. The community was slowly waking up. Betty Chen revealed she was actually a retired paralegal and offered to help with legal research. Tom Hendress shared his own expertise with bridge construction from his Army engineering days. Sarah Walsh, the local reporter, began asking pointed questions about HOA finances. We held our strategy sessions at Betty's kitchen table, and I'm telling you, the woman brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead. During one of these meetings, Sarah brought up something interesting. The HOA's financial records were public, and Margaret had been spending money like she was, running a small country instead of a neighborhood association. The evening loons were calling across. The lake, when Betty dropped the real bombshell, she'd found the HOA's budget reports, and they were spending almost twice their income. Margaret had approved a $40,000 landscaping project that amounted to a few decorative boulders and some shrubs. That's when I realized what this was really about. The HOA was desperate for new revenue, and they thought controlling my bridge would let them charge me monthly access fees. Margaret wasn't just power-hungry. She was trying to solve a financial crisis by picking my pocket. The smell of fresh pine drifted through Betty's open kitchen window as we pored over documents, and I felt that familiar engineer's satisfaction, when all the pieces of a complex problem finally start falling into place. Margaret had no idea what kind of storm she'd just unleashed. Her next move was nothing short of sabotage. She hired a contractor to install what she called decorative barriers along the bridge approach. Concrete blocks disguised as landscaping, but strategically placed to stop my truck from ever reaching the bridge. The shrill grind of a concrete saw at 7 in the morning woke half the neighborhood, and the dust cloud swirling in the air made it look like a tornado had touched down. When I arrived to find my access completely blocked, there was Margaret, clipboard in hand, claiming it was a beautification project approved by the Architectural Committee. The funny thing about that committee? It consisted solely of Margaret and 2 residents, too afraid of her to ever disagree. But this time, Margaret made a mistake I could use in court. I filed for an emergency injunction to have the barriers removed, armed with my original bridge deed and a certified survey that proved the approach road was part of my property. The judge wasn't amused. When Margaret tried lecturing him about community standards and property values, he cut her off mid-sentence and ordered the barriers removed within 24 hours. When she kept arguing, he slapped her with a $2,500 contempt fine. Outside the courthouse, I took a moment to educate the small crowd that had gathered. Knowledge nugget: you cannot legally block someone's access to their own property. That's called landlocking, and it's illegal in all 50 states. Courts take property access very seriously, so document everything if someone tries to restrict yours. Margaret's retaliation was as swift as it was childish. She launched a harassment campaign that would have made a middle school bully proud. Anonymous tips to county inspectors about fake safety violations at my cabin, noise complaints about my truck that visited only twice a month, and constant pressure on HOA residents to ostracize me and anyone who supported me. She even tried to have my engineering license investigated, claiming I was mentally unstable and a danger to public safety. The state board took one look at my spotless record and told her, in essence, to stop wasting their time. But something was shifting in the community. Tom Hendress formed what he called the Bridge Defense Committee, a group of residents finally fed up with Margaret's reign of terror. Betty Chin, using her paralegal skills, started digging into Margaret's past and discovered a disturbing pattern. She'd pulled the same stunts in her previous neighborhood before moving to Cedar Falls, picking fights, filing frivolous lawsuits, and tormenting anyone who stood up to her. Meanwhile, Sarah Walsh was quietly investigating the HOA's finances, and the numbers weren't adding up. There were strange payments, suspicious consulting fees, and expenses that didn't match any actual improvements. Then, during a routine call, my homeowner's insurance agent dropped a bombshell. If anything happened to my bridge, if it was damaged or destroyed, the entire subdivision would become landlocked. Property values would nosedive, and insurance companies would refuse coverage for homes unreachable by emergency vehicles. When I shared that revelation with the Bridge Defense Committee, you could almost hear the collective light bulb flicker on. Margaret wasn't just harassing me, she was threatening everyone's property values with her reckless behavior. Realizing she was losing control, Margaret called an emergency HOA meeting to address what she called the Jake problem. Her PowerPoint, complete with Comic Sans font, made even her loyalists cringe. Her proposal? A special assessment to buy out my bridge rights for a laughable $5,000, a bridge that would cost $200,000 to build today. The audacity was breathtaking. Tension in the neighborhood hit a breaking point. Anonymous flyers started showing up labeling me a community enemy. Someone left a nasty note on my truck windshield. Betty's garden hose was mysteriously slashed in the middle of the night. Even the local coffee shop fell silent when I walked in. Neighbors glaring at each other, lines drawn. The peaceful community my grandfather loved was turning into a battleground. All because one woman couldn't accept that she didn't control everyone and everything around her. Still, I had patience and proof on my side. Margaret was digging her own grave with every desperate move. The question wasn't if she'd hang herself with her own rope. It was how much damage she'd cause before doing it. That evening, I sat on my bridge, listening to Whisper Creek running steadily below. The water had flowed there long before Margaret arrived, and it would keep flowing long after she was gone. Some things are simply bigger than petty tyrants and their delusions of power. At 6 the next morning, my phone rang. Betty Chen's voice was trembling with excitement. "Jake, you need to get over here right now. I found something huge in the HOA charter." I grabbed my coffee and drove straight to her house. What she showed me changed everything. Buried deep in the original HOA charter was a clause stating that existing property rights remain unchanged upon formation of the association. Here's the kicker. The HOA was formed in March 2023, 6 months after my grandfather's death, and you can't retroactively change property rights through private agreements made after the fact. Margaret's entire legal argument was built on quicksand, but Betty hadn't stopped there. She'd also been combing through the HOA's financial records with bloodhound persistence, and what she uncovered made my coffee go cold. $23,000 was missing from the HOA's reserve fund, funneled into something called Thornfield Consulting Services. Margaret had been embezzling from her own neighbors. Sarah Walsh confirmed it an hour later with bank statements she obtained through a public records request. Margaret's personal consulting company had been receiving regular payments from the HOA for absolutely nothing. No contracts, no deliverables, no proof of any work, just money quietly siphoned from the community straight into Margaret's pocket. My hands trembled as I read the documents, and it wasn't the caffeine. The entire bridge fiasco had never been about community standards or property values. It had been a distraction, a smokescreen for Margaret's financial crimes. I was the perfect scapegoat, an outsider who traveled often, easy to paint as a troublemaker while she looted the HOA's funds unchecked. The balance of power had just shifted. Margaret wasn't a tyrant anymore. She was a criminal caught red-handed. And I held 3 devastating pieces of evidence: undisputed proof of bridge ownership, documentation of her harassment campaign, and now, clear, undeniable evidence of embezzlement. Knowledge. Nugget, sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free. It buries the liar who tried to chain you. When someone pushes a conflict far beyond reason, start asking what they're trying to hide. Bullies lash out to distract from their own guilt, and Margaret was no exception. Her mask of control cracked wide open. Her attorney quietly withdrew from the case, citing ethical concerns, which, in lawyer language, means they finally realized their client was guilty as sin. 2 HOA board members who once defended her began to back away. Even Margaret's husband started asking uneasy questions about their sudden financial blessings. The same neighbors who had once praised her leadership were now whispering doubts. They remembered the shady landscaping project she pushed through without competitive bids, and how she insisted on managing all finances personally instead of using the HOA's established accounting firm. I knew I could have filed my own lawsuit and probably walked away with a decent settlement. But this had become bigger than bridge access. It was about protecting the entire community from a predator who had been quietly stealing from her neighbors while using intimidation to silence anyone who stood in her way. The steady rush of Whisper Creek beneath my bridge became my soundtrack for thinking. That water was constant, patient, unstoppable, shaping the stone not through violence but persistence. Margaret had underestimated the power of patience sharpened by truth. She was about to learn an expensive lesson in the difference between genuine authority and the kind built on fear and deceit. Once, the truth about her embezzlement came to light. Our small resistance group transformed into a full-blown task force. Betty Chen's kitchen became our war room. The smell of strong coffee mixed with the energy of people who'd finally had enough of being pushed around. Betty handled legal research and documentation. Her paralegal training was worth its weight in gold. Tom Hendricks coordinated with other affected residents, using his natural charisma to rally our coalition. Sarah Walsh began crafting her investigative article, verifying every fact until it was bulletproof. I called in a favor from a lawyer friend who agreed to guide our legal strategy pro bono. Turns out, when you've got rock-solid evidence of embezzlement, lawyers get very interested in helping you. Our plan had three prongs: file a formal complaint with the State Attorney General for HOA fraud, demand a forensic audit of the finances, and pursue damages for harassment, defamation, and interference with property rights. We also sought Margaret's immediate removal from the board, but I wasn't relying solely on the legal front. I compiled a detailed bridge inspection report that would have impressed the Army Corps of Engineers, complete with load analyses, stress calculations, safety certifications, professional photos, and a signed verification from a colleague at my engineering firm. Knowledge nugget. HOA board members have fiduciary duties. They're legally bound to act in the community's best interest, not their own. Embezzling HOA funds is a felony in most states, and residents are entitled to see all financial records. Always demand transparency. The technical side was vital, but the real power came from people. I visited every affected homeowner personally, explaining the situation calmly and letting the facts speak for themselves. The response was overwhelming. People were furious, not just about the bullying, but about being robbed. We built a coalition of 31 out of 47 homeowners. These weren't just signatures. They were people ready to take a stand when it mattered. Tom's wife started bringing homemade cookies to our meetings and jokingly named us the Bridge Club. The name stuck. Even Diesel, my orange tabby, became our mascot, attending every meeting and purring loudly whenever we made progress. Betty's filing system was a masterpiece, color-coded, cross-referenced, time-stamped. Every document verified, every piece of evidence organized for maximum impact. She'd missed her calling as a federal investigator, but Margaret wasn't sitting quietly. She hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on me. She spread rumors that we were conspiracy theorists out to destroy the community. She even tried to schedule a rival HOA meeting the same night as our town hall. Meanwhile, I strengthened my defense. Professional colleagues wrote character references. Past clients submitted testimonials about my integrity. My professional association confirmed my spotless record. Even contacts from my international renewable energy work vouched for me. The trap we were building was simple and elegant. We would let Margaret destroy herself in front of witnesses, with county officials and reporters present. I prepared questions that would corner her into lying publicly, while Sarah had already tipped off the state fraud investigators. Betty's kitchen buzzed with the sound of rustling papers as we sorted evidence for maximum effect. We assigned speaking roles, prepared for every possible response, and arranged media coverage to ensure transparency. Each evening, as I ran my hands along the smooth steel cables of my bridge, I remembered why I became an engineer: to create things that endure, to solve problems that matter, to strengthen communities instead of dividing them. Margaret had spent months trying to tear down what my grandfather built. Now it was time to show her what happens when you challenge someone who builds bridges instead of burning them. As autumn leaves crackled beneath our feet during final preparations, I understood this was no longer just about property rights. It was about standing up to bullies, protecting the innocent, and proving that ordinary people can fight corruption when they stand together. Across Pine Lake, the loons called out as if echoing the same truth that flowed beneath my bridge: some things are worth fighting for, and patience joined with truth is an unstoppable force. Margaret was about to learn that the hard way. Her desperation finally boiled over at 3 in the morning when she crept onto my property with a crowbar and tried to damage my bridge. The metallic screech and her labored breathing were captured in crystal clear audio by the security cameras I'd installed after her earlier sabotage attempts. Watching that footage the next morning was surreal. There she was, the self-proclaimed guardian of community standards, reduced to a vandal in the night. The damage was minimal. My grandfather's bridge was built too strong for a crowbar to leave a mark. The intent was as plain as daylight. I filed a police report but chose not to press charges right away. Instead, I used the footage strategically, sharing it quietly with the few HOA board members who still had their wits about them. The impact was immediate. 2 more members resigned rather than be associated with Margaret's increasingly erratic behavior. But Margaret wasn't finished humiliating herself. She launched a full-blown smear campaign using anonymous social media accounts to attack my character. Suddenly, fake reviews of my engineering work started appearing online, and posts labeling me as dangerous or mentally unstable popped up in neighborhood Facebook groups. Ironically, the cyberbullying only backfired on her. Knowledge nugget: anonymous online attacks can be traced, and defamation, spoken or written, is still defamation. Always take screenshots. Digital evidence vanishes fast, but screenshots are forever. The neighborhood was quickly growing tired of Margaret's antics. Her own neighbors began reporting strange late-night activity around her house. The support that once upheld her reign of intimidation was dissolving faster than morning dew. Meanwhile, Betty Chen's contacts in the banking world uncovered something far worse. Margaret had tried to take out an emergency loan using HOA reserve funds without proper board approval. When the bank refused, she forged the signatures of other board members on the loan documents. That's when I knew we had her cornered. Embezzlement was bad enough, but forgery? That pushed her crimes into federal territory. Sensing the walls closing in, Margaret made one last desperate move. Out of nowhere, she called me, voice trembling, offering a $15,000 bribe to drop everything and walk away. I legally recorded the conversation, and it turned out to be gold. She openly admitted she may have made mistakes with HOA money and even confessed to other financial irregularities I hadn't yet discovered. Margaret was unraveling in real time. "Look, Jake," she said, her voice cracking, "maybe I got a little overzealous about community standards. Maybe some paperwork got mixed up. But we can work this out privately, can't we?" The community tension was boiling over. Some residents feared their property values would plummet from the scandal, while others were furious they'd been paying HOA fees to fund Margaret's corruption. The once peaceful neighborhood felt like it was collectively holding its breath, waiting for the next explosion. Grocery store aisles became battle lines. Former friends stopped speaking. Margaret had managed to divide a community that had lived in harmony for years, but not everyone bought her act. 3 more residents came forward with their own horror stories: harassment, financial misconduct, and abuse of power going back to her very first year as HOA president. The pattern was undeniable to anyone willing to look. Then came her final, most revealing threat. One evening, completely unhinged, she called to threaten me directly, promising to destroy my reputation if I didn't back off. She claimed to have connections that could ruin my career and even threatened to fabricate safety violations on my bridge. She was clearly losing her grip on reality. With criminal charges looming, her community turning against her, and her husband gone with the kids, she still believed she could intimidate her way out of the chaos she'd created. I documented every escalation carefully, building a detailed timeline of her downward spiral. My restraint and professionalism stood in sharp contrast to her frantic attempts at control. That night, sitting on my bridge beneath the stars reflecting on Pine Lake, I realized Margaret had become her own worst enemy. Every move she made to escape accountability only buried her deeper. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had started all this to steal money and rule through fear, and now she was facing prosecution while destroying her own reputation beyond repair. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting your enemies hang themselves with the rope they wove. Her last desperate act came at 2 a.m. when she called County Emergency Services, claiming my bridge was collapsing and posed an immediate danger to the public. The sirens shattered the quiet night. Fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency vehicles roared down the street, diesel engines rumbling, radio chatter filling the air. At 2:47 a.m., the fire chief called me. "Jake, we've got reports of a structural failure at your bridge. We need you to come down here and assess it." When I arrived, Margaret stood there in her bathrobe, pointing dramatically at the bridge and claiming she'd heard cracking sounds signaling imminent collapse. Captain Rodriguez, the no-nonsense fire chief, looked from her to me. "You're the engineer who built bridges overseas, right?" he asked. When I nodded, he said, "Mind taking a look?" 10 minutes later, my inspection was complete. Every joint was firm, every beam perfectly secure. The bridge was as sound as the day my grandfather had finished it. Rodriguez watched as I worked, then turned to the gathered crowd and declared, "This bridge is safer than most county roads." Margaret's credibility died right there, in front of half the neighborhood, The fire chief didn't sugarcoat it. "Ma'am, filing false emergency reports is a crime. You've wasted taxpayer resources and endangered real emergencies by tying up our crews." But the real blow came the next morning. State investigators completed their forensic audit of HOA finances, and the findings were staggering. $31,000 in unexplained expenses, all traced back to Margaret's personal accounts through fake consulting invoices. Knowledge nugget: every digital transaction leaves a trail, and forensic accountants are relentless bloodhounds when it comes to money. Embezzlement always starts small, and always grows when no one's watching. Watching Margaret's psychological collapse was both tragic and revealing. She began accusing random neighbors of being part of elaborate conspiracies, leaving paranoid notes on doors claiming I was tied to a deep state plot against suburban life. Her husband had left, her kids were gone, and even her most loyal followers were slipping away. But amid her chaos, something beautiful emerged. The residents organized a Bridge Appreciation Day, bringing picnics to the lakeside and celebrating the bridge that literally, and now symbolically, connected them. Children covered the bridge approaches with colorful chalk art, transforming Margaret's emblem of division into a symbol of unity. The media attention was overwhelming. Sarah Walsh's article was picked up by regional news outlets, and the story went viral across social media under the hashtag #ShatterBridge. Justice finally caught up. National HOA reform advocates began citing our case as a textbook example of what happens when petty tyrants are given unchecked power. Margaret quickly became a cautionary tale in property rights circles, the poster child for everything wrong with HOA culture. Her face was splashed across news sites as the HOA president who tried to steal a bridge. The legal fallout came fast. The state attorney general filed criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. The HOA launched a civil suit demanding restitution. Her real estate license was under review for professional misconduct. And the IRS began asking uncomfortable questions about unreported income. One evening, as I sat on my bridge watching the sunset, it struck me that this fight had never really been about me. I had become a symbol, proof that ordinary people could stand up to small-time tyranny and actually win. The birds called across the lake, and the peace that settled over the water felt like a benediction after months of chaos. Margaret had tried to turn my inheritance into her personal cash cow, but in doing so, she awakened a community that refused to be bullied. Her final desperate act was attempting to flee town with the last HOA funds she could access, about $8,000 in cash. Airport security caught her at the gate, and local news cameras filmed her perp walk in all its pathetic glory. Standing there in handcuffs, her perfectly manicured image finally cracked. Beneath the designer clothes and fake authority, she looked like what she truly was. Just another small-time crook who got too greedy. The woman who had spent months trying to destroy my reputation was now a national laughingstock. Her downfall was poetic. Her own lies, theft, and abuse of power had built the prison she now lived in. As the police car carried Margaret away, I thought of Grandpa's bridge, still standing strong, still connecting communities, still serving its purpose long after the woman who tried to steal it had been forgotten. Some things are built to last, others are built to fall. The town hall that night was packed beyond capacity, 200 people crammed into a space built for half that. News crews from 3 stations filled the back, cameras rolling, reporters scribbling notes. The mayor had called the emergency meeting after Margaret's arrest made regional headlines, and everyone was eager to see how this community soap opera would end. I walked to the podium with my presentation materials, surprisingly calm for someone about to expose months of corruption before half the county. My visual aids were simple but devastating: a timeline of harassment, the original bridge deed, and bank records showing exactly where the HOA's money had gone. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "6 months ago, I thought I was dealing with an overzealous HOA president. What I discovered was systematic theft from community funds, harassment of residents, and abuse of power that turned our neighborhood into a dictatorship." The room went silent as I laid out the evidence. every incident documented with photos and timestamps, every irregularity traced through bank records, every lie Margaret told disproven with official documents that couldn't be denied. Margaret sat in the front row between her court-appointed attorney and a county sheriff's deputy. Technically out on bail, she'd been told not to speak. That advice lasted 5 minutes. When I played the recording of her own voice admitting to misusing HOA funds, she jumped up and began shouting, "This is all a conspiracy! Jake orchestrated my financial problems. He's been planning this from the beginning." Her lawyer tried to restrain her, but Margaret was past reason. She pointed wildly at the crowd, accusing everyone of betrayal, insisting I had somehow forced her to embezzle and harass neighbors. It was a full psychological breakdown, in front of 200 witnesses and 3 rolling cameras. "Mrs. Thornfield," the mayor said firmly, "you're out of order." "Please sit down." "Out of order?" she screamed. "I'll show you what's out of order. This man has destroyed everything I built in this community." That was my cue. "Margaret," I said evenly, "the only thing you built in this community was a criminal enterprise funded by your neighbor's HOA fees. The only thing I destroyed was your ability to keep stealing from the people who trusted you." The room erupted in applause. Even some of Margaret's former supporters joined in. Camera flashes lit up the chamber, capturing the moment a small-town tyrant was finally held accountable. Betty Chen spoke next, detailing how her legal research uncovered the fraudulent property claims. Tom Hendricks followed, describing the harassment campaign against veterans. 3 more residents shared stories of Margaret's bullying. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't about one bridge dispute, but years of systematic abuse. County Sheriff Martinez outlined the criminal charges: first-degree embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and filing false police reports. A state investigator explained that federal authorities were reviewing possible tax violations. The FBI representative confirmed they were looking into mail fraud connected to fake HOA documents. Judge Patterson, attending as a community member, announced an emergency restraining order barring Margaret from all HOA property and meetings. She was also required to surrender every document and dollar still in her possession. The media frenzy intensified. Reporters asked about property rights reform. National advocacy groups reached out about legislative testimony. Online, the story trended for days as people shared their own HOA horror stories. Margaret's final humiliation came when Sheriff Martinez led her away in handcuffs as the cameras rolled. The woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood was now a living warning. Children who once shrank from her glares now waved goodbye as the police car pulled away. The community's response was cathartic. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months hugged and apologized for letting the situation go on so long. Those once too afraid to speak finally shared their experiences. The air buzzed with relief, coffee, and the first signs of healing. Flashbulbs continued popping, not just to document Margaret's downfall, but to capture the moment a fractured neighborhood began to rebuild itself. When the meeting ended and people filed out into the cool evening air, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. Grandpa's bridge had become more than just a path to my cabin. It had become a symbol of endurance, justice, and the strength of a community that finally stood together. It had become a symbol of standing up to bullies and protecting communities from predators. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a community had learned it could fight back. The transformation of our community was remarkable. Within 30 days, we'd elected a new HOA board, with Betty Chen as president, chosen unanimously by residents who'd learned the hard way what happens when you give unchecked power to the wrong person. They asked me to serve on the board, but I politely declined. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime. Margaret's legal troubles snowballed exactly as you'd expect. She pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud, receiving 2 years in prison and 5 years of probation. The judge ordered her to pay $47,000 in restitution to the HOA, money that went toward fixing the financial mess she'd created. Her real estate license was permanently revoked, and her husband filed for divorce before she even got out on bail. But the real healing happened in the community itself. I organized the first annual Bridge Festival that October, exactly 1 year after Margaret had tried to block my access. Families brought picnics. Kids played games on the bridge approaches, and we raised $8,000 for local veterans programs that Tom Hriss recommended. The most meaningful moment came when Margaret's teenage daughter showed up with a handwritten apology letter. That kid had watched her mother's behavior with horror and wanted to make things right. She became the first recipient of the engineering scholarship fund I established with donations from grateful community members. My personal life took an unexpected turn, too. Instead of returning to overseas work, I decided to open an engineering consulting firm right here in Cedar Falls. Turns out, there's a huge need for someone who specializes in helping small communities with infrastructure issues, and I'd found my calling in service rather than just profit. The property rights education website I created has helped dozens of other communities facing similar HOA tyranny. I've testified before 3 state legislatures about HOA reform, and the Cedar Falls case is now cited in legal textbooks as an example of how communities can fight back against corruption. The conservation initiative around the bridge became something Grandpa would have loved. We partnered with environmental groups to turn the area into a protected wildlife habitat, complete with educational programs about the local ecosystem. The bridge that Margaret tried to steal became a symbol of community stewardship and environmental protection. Property values in lakeside estates actually increased after the scandal, which surprised everyone except real estate professionals. Turns out buyers prefer communities that have proven they can handle corruption rather than places where it might still be lurking in the shadows. Sarah Walsh won a regional journalism award for her investigative reporting on HOA financial abuse. Betty Chen's systematic documentation methods are now taught in paralegal schools across the state. Tom Hendris started a consulting service helping other communities organize against HOA abuse. The Bridge Defense Committee evolved into a permanent community advocacy group that helps residents navigate disputes and ensures transparent governance. They meet monthly at Betty's house, and yes, Diesel still attends every meeting as the official mascot. Margaret's former house became a community garden after the bank foreclosed. There's something poetic about vegetables growing where such toxicity once lived. Kids who were once afraid of her angry face now play among tomato plants and sunflowers. 6 months ago, a family moved to Cedar Falls specifically because they'd heard about our community's fight against corruption. They said they wanted to live somewhere that had proven it wouldn't tolerate bullies. That's when I knew we'd really won. The final statistics tell the story. HOA financial health restored within 6 months. 0 harassment complaints filed since Margaret's removal. And 12 other communities have contacted me for help with similar situations. The county declared Grandpa's Bridge historically significant, ensuring it'll be protected for future generations. Looking back, I realized this was never really about bridge access or HOA fees. It was about whether ordinary people would stand up to petty tyrants who think authority gives them the right to steal and intimidate. Sometimes it takes one person willing to fight back to give everyone else permission to stop being afraid. As I write this, I can hear children's laughter echoing across the bridge during this year's festival. The smell of barbecue smoke mixes with the fresh autumn air, and Old Glory flies proudly from the bridge tower. Grandpa's structure stands solid and enduring, just like the justice it came to represent. Now, I want to hear from you. Share your own HOA nightmare stories in the comments below. You'd be amazed how many of these situations follow the same pattern. And if this story inspired you to stand up to bullies in your own community, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't believe what happened in the next town.